Today we're talking about the top 3 myths I hear talked about the Line 6 Helix based off of user comments and questions that I get either on YouTube or through various other means of contact, and things that I think the record needs to be set straight about. So without further ado, we're going to dive right in today and talk about what I feel are the top 3 myths about the Line 6 Helix and the HX Stomp. Myth number 1 that I'd like to talk about that I hear and I have heard spoken about for many years now. There's a little less talk about this myth now that we had the stock cab update in firmware 3.5, but there is this idea that the Helix is pretty much unusable unless we're somehow using third-party impulse responses. Now, let me preface this by saying I have nothing against third-party impulse responses. I make my own impulse responses and I have some available up on my website and on the Line 6 Marketplace. So I have nothing against utilizing a third-party impulse response if it's giving you what you want. That is not the topic here, and I cannot be clear enough about that. If you're using impulse responses and they're working for you, then carry on. They can be an incredible tool. That's not what this discussion is about. So I don't want to hear comments saying that I'm against impulse responses or I think they're bad somehow. But there's this myth that's been floating around for years that we can't get a decent sound out of the Helix unless we use a third-party impulse response. There are third-party impulse responses that will give you far worse results than what you can get right from the Helix. And I'm not just talking about utilizing the new cabs. I'm talking about even with the legacy cabs. So let's dive in, take a look and a listen to what we can actually accomplish with the stock cabs. So I just grabbed my incredible Gibson 335 guitar. I've got a blank preset here. Now, one thing I'm going to do for any tones here, and anytime I utilize my Helix, I just come right over and I add in a dynamic ambience, and I have these user default settings that I like here, just so that things aren't so bone dry. The thing about modular tone, and the reason I think a lot of people, when they first use modelers and maybe throw in an amp and a cab and they play it, it sounds extremely bone dry. And oftentimes by just adding a little natural ambience to the sound, it kind of brings it to life and makes it sound a lot nicer. So I'm just going to come in here, pick an amp that I absolutely love, which is the Placator Dirty. Now, I have these pretty much at stock settings, maybe slightly tweaked. I think I turned the fat and the C45 off, set that as a user default as well. Now, obviously, this is going to sound absolutely horrendous. We don't have a cab here, so we don't want to listen to that too much. But I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go straight to the cab block. I'm actually going to go to the single legacy cab. I am going to pull up one of my favorites, the Greenback 25, 412 Greenback 25. I'm going to throw a 160 ribbon on it. I'm going to maybe move that back 4 inches. And I'm even going to get rid of this low and high cut just to show that even under the worst scenario, I can get a decent tone out of this. And actually not just a decent tone, a really killer tone out of this. And I just did that instinctively. I have no idea what this is going to sound like, but let's take a listen. Again, that dynamic ambience, if I turn it off, this is what you'll get. Still a great tone, but we just have that very bone dry sound to it. I think you'll agree the dynamic ambience just gives it a little bit of life and a little bit more realism to it. So I really like that. So you can see there, in a matter of seconds, I was able to bring in a really nice rock crunch tone. Obviously, there's different mics we could play with here. You can play around with the distance. That's not my favorite mic, but again, great tone immediately. We could maybe pull up a 7 dynamic. Obviously, I could go play with the tone stack on the amp model, but these are usable tones immediately. Ribbon mic right up on the 1 inch distance, obviously going to be a little bit tubby. So remember, this is using the legacy cabs before we could even move the microphones around. Let's swap that out to not a dual, but a single cab of the new version of this cab. And we'll go to the Greenback 25 and we'll just go with these default settings again. Now, not something I'm going to like, I know, because there's a 57 dynamic, but again, nothing wrong with that, but I don't really hear it being millions of times better than the legacy cab. I probably would go with this just because I have that ability to move the positioning of the mic around, which is very handy to have. But I could come something like to the 160 ribbon, do something similar to what I had. And again, I've got really usable tone that's very tweakable, more so now that we can move those mics around. So I think you can see here that with either the legacy cabs or the new cabs, there isn't any great, and again, I put this in capital letters, need for third-party impulse responses. But again, if you have third-party impulse responses that you like better, then use those. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I am saying give the stock cabs a chance, whether legacy or the new updated cabs, and hopefully that can go towards killing this myth that somehow there's a need for third-party impulse responses. Myth number 2 that I want to talk about is a comment that I've gotten quite a bit over the years, that we need to add a lot of EQ and compression and a lot of sweeteners for the Helix to sound good. And that is simply not true. Now, some of that, as far as those comments being directed to me, is because of my template that I use. And a lot of folks have it in their mind that I'm using tons of EQ and tons of compression to somehow shape the sound of the Helix. And that could not be further from the truth. I do love using the shelf EQ, but again, it's used very, very subtly just to give a final little bit of polish to the sound, make it a little bit more mix ready, whether we're using it in the studio or live. And it also gives us the ability to tweak on the fly in a very intuitive manner. So that's the reason I like to have that in there, not because it needs to be there. We can get a great tone of the Helix without that, but I do prefer to have it there for the reasons I just mentioned. Now, compression. Again, when I'm using that end of chain compression, it is so subtle that until we take it away, we may not even notice it. So again, it's not that that needs to be there, but it's just another step, just like I would work in the actual studio with my real amps. If I threw a mic up in front of any of these amps, recorded that track, once I was in the mix working with this, I would oftentimes maybe add a little bit of shelf EQ or some other type of EQ very subtly just to get it to sit in the mix. And I'm going to add some compression to it just to help it sit in the mix as well. So all I'm doing is, instead of doing that in the studio, I'm doing it within the Helix preset. So let's take a look and see how quickly, without any tweaking or sweetening, we can get great tones out of the Helix in just a matter of seconds. I'm going to keep that same little dynamic ambience reverb I had before. Let's pick a different amp this time. I don't know. Let's just go to something like the US Princess, let's say, and then we'll come over to our cab section and we'll add the 110 US Princess, the sort of paired up natural pairing. Now, this is just with the stock settings that come up, and both default settings on the amp and on the cab. I have that little bit dynamic ambience. And let's just hear what we have here. Flip over to the neck pickup. Again, a very usable tone just immediately out of the box. Now, I would probably instinctively come in here and change a few things. I might bring that bass back, maybe bump that treble up a bit. Just like we would do on any normal amp. I might come in here and swap the mics out to something that I prefer a little bit more. And extremely usable tone in seconds. I didn't need to put compression. I didn't need to put the high and low shelf EQ. But if I was going to utilize this preset, I absolutely would put those things in there just to add that little bit of polish to my sound, make them a little bit more mix ready. So I could do this with any number of amps, and I have done this with any number of amps in the Helix, where I just throw an amp up there with very default settings, add a little bit of reverb, maybe move the mic around, adjust the tone stack on the amp, and you're in business. So the Helix does not need any of these sweeteners, but it doesn't mean that we couldn't or shouldn't use them. And once we understand how to do those things, which I've talked about in so many videos, we can get our workflow working to a point where we can get great tones in seconds. The third myth I wanted to talk about is this idea that the Helix is outdated and no longer relevant or valid. There have been so many new modelers come out, modelers and profilers, something like Tonex, which a lot of folks who watch my channel know. I have a Kemper, I have a Tonex, I have a Quad Cortex. I've used fractal units before. I used to own the FM3, and to be quite honest with you, in my opinion, I hear folks making all these grandiose statements about how Helix sucks and Fractal's the best, or Fractal sucks and Tonex is the best. The Fender ToneMaster Pro is better than the Quad Core. And most of those people that are making these outlandish statements really haven't done proper comparisons where they've looked at just one thing at a time, you know, the amp modeling through the same impulse response, let's say, so we can actually judge the amp modeling. And then volume match those so that they're identical, and then play the same performance through them so everything else is identical. If you're not doing that, you've never really compared things in a way that's going to be meaningful. You really need to analyze one thing at a time. If you want to know who has the best amp modeling, you have to then take the amp modeling of that particular amp, run it through the same impulse response, volume match it, play the same performance by reamp or a looper through it, volume matched perfectly, as I've mentioned so many times because it's so important. And only then will you be able to A/B between them and really hear any differences. And the funny thing is, I've done a lot of these blind A/B comparisons on my channel before, and not shockingly at all, when you do a comparison properly, a lot of these differences that folks think they hear magically disappear, and nobody really does know what they're hearing or listening to. So I'm not saying that there aren't other great modelers out there. I enjoy all of them. Something like Tonex and Kemper is only going to be as good as the profile or tone model it was captured. As far as something like Fractal or the Helix or the Quad Cortex, when you're not dealing with the neural captures, it's only going to be as good as how we dial it in, I guess. If we grab an amp like the US Princess and, you know, go to the cab, throw a 57 on there, straight onto the center of the cone, and then come in here and dial all the bass out and, you know, crank up treble and presence, which I don't even think is a thing on there, and pull the mids out and do these wild, crazy settings, we're going to have a ridiculously awful tone that's extremely different than the tone I had just got from this same amp and cab moments ago. So if you're taking something like this, making these types of settings, I mean, this is obviously extreme, and then comparing this to a completely different set of settings on a similar amp on a different modeler, well, yeah, the other modeler is going to win. It's not because the other modeler is quote unquote better. It's because we didn't do things right and the comparison wasn't done correctly. So again, I'm not saying that other modelers aren't incredible. I think we live in a day and age as guitar players that we've never been more fortunate. We can get great tone in any of these. And if anybody handed me any of the modern day modelers today and said I had to do a recording session or a live performance with it, I have a feeling that within about a minute to 2 minutes, I could have presets set up that are going to sound just wonderful and the audience is going to enjoy. So I hope you enjoyed that look at what I feel, based off comments and questions that I get, are the top 3 myths about the Line 6 Helix. And I hope that that maybe sparks your interest into diving into your Helix and trying some things you haven't tried, maybe simplifying or trying the compressor high and low shelf tricks that I always use in my presets. Go give those things a try, and I hope you enjoy. I'm going to leave you today with the demo video for my just today released new Helix preset, which is available at my website at the link below. This is going to be a part of a series I'm going to do utilizing dual amps in the Helix, complementary amps that work really well together. other. This first one is what I am calling my dual Dripman 45 preset. It's a combination of the Brit J45 Bright amp model and the US Dripman amp model. I found there's a really nice combination between those two. I'm going to leave you today with the demo video for that. The link is below if you're so inclined and want to grab a copy of that preset for yourself. Thanks so much for tuning in. Really do appreciate you sharing your time with me. Please like the video, share it with anybody you think would get some use or enjoyment out of watching, and also please subscribe to the channel. Hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. I'll be back really soon with some more. Thanks again so much for tuning in. Ciao for now.